So one good reason, then, to avoid plagiarism is simply because it can get you into a great deal of trouble, but it is probably not the best reason for us to avoid it. And as we go on this morning, I hope to convince you for other reasons that plagiarism is something that ought to be avoided, and that includes in the fields of science, technology, and engineering. So what exactly is plagiarism and what is wrong with it? What has become clear to me is that in many fields in science and technology, people have a very limited understanding of what plagiarism is in the first place, and sometimes they seem to think that some aspects of plagiarism are simply not applicable to them. So let me start with a simple definition. Plagiarism is presenting someone else's work as your own. This can be their words, their ideas, their research findings, or even the processes that they have used. But still we might ask, but what's wrong with this in the first place? If what you have written is scientifically correct, what is the problem with not citing the original source? After all, it's not quite the same thing as when we're dealing with things like falsification of data or the deliberate manipulation of findings. Plagiarism is not likely to lead to harmful consequences to the health and the well-being of the public. So perhaps it is not really something that we should be that concerned about. Well, basically what is wrong with it simply is that it is theft. Someone else has done the work, someone else has come up with certain results, ideas, or even words, and the plagiarist essentially has stolen that person's work. So I often ask people to have a look at this statement. Interestingly, most of the groups that I speak to get it right, and they say, yes, it must be plagiarized because these are hard facts, these are numbers which someone has to have gone and done the research to discover what these numbers are, and without a reference, you are presenting something as your own which you cannot have discovered on your own, unless, of course, you did the research yourself. Of course, these figures, for those of you who are in the health sciences will know, come from the Green Paper on the National Health Insurance, which basically gives the same general idea, just expressed in slightly different form. But recently, in a workshop with a group of pediatricians, one participant said to me, no, this is not plagiarism. And his reasoning was that everybody in the health professionals these days knows these numbers. And so I had to point out to him that, yes, it may be common knowledge now amongst most health professionals in this country that 50% roughly of what we spend on health goes to a really small percentage of the population. That may be common knowledge. But the exact numbers can only be found out by empirical research. And so because you are now citing these facts, you have to nonetheless give a reference to show where this information comes from, because such kinds of hard facts should be verifiable by your audience. The example I often use for this comes from some work that one of my students did. So if I were to find this in someone else's work, any moral justification of the culling of elephants should follow lines similar to those proposed by just war theorists. For a cull to be justified, certain conditions should be met before engaging in a cull, such as that elephant overpopulation is threatening other species, and other conditions should be met during the performance of a cull, such as that as little trauma and physical suffering should be caused to elephants as possible. Now, because I know the original work, I would know that this is plagiarized. But what exactly is plagiarized about it? It's very difficult, isn't it, to identify this sort of plagiarism if you don't know the literature in a particular field. What I keep trying to remind our students is that we wouldn't be their teachers if we didn't know the literature in our field. In this case, it was a master's student of mine, and what she did was she devised a theory of a just cull, she called it. And she modeled this theory on an ancient theory that you find in ethics called the theory of a just war. And what she proposed was that there should be certain conditions that need to be met pre-cull and certain conditions that need to be met during the cull for us to be able to say that any particular act of culling elephants is morally justified at any particular time. Now, this is a very, very unique argumentative structure. And you can see that it is not something that necessarily anybody would simply come up with. And so that argumentative structure needs to be cited. What's more is that the basic idea for this structure of hers, in fact, came from someone else. Professor Henny Lotter from University of Johannesburg had written a paper also about culling some years before, and he didn't really spell it out in much detail. All that he did was he said, perhaps we should treat culling in the same way as we treat war, and as we have a theory of just war, we should have a theory of a just cull. He left it there. My student then went on from there to use that kernel of an idea to develop her own theory of a just cull. Clearly, that meant that she had to acknowledge in her work that the original idea came from Henny Lotter. We talk about it a lot these days, but the term itself is problematic, isn't it? Because if by definition plagiarism is presenting someone else's work as your own, you can't plagiarize yourself, just as you can't steal from yourself in any kind of meaningful way. So it's not really terribly sensible for us to be using this term, but that is the term which is being used. And really what people mean when they talk about self-plagiarism is the inappropriate reuse of your own work. It's not theft, but it certainly can be academic dishonesty and possibly even fraud. And in the publish or perish culture of academic life these days, I think there is a strong temptation for people to recycle their research to try to get as many publication credits out of it as they possibly can. And so what is happening more and more is that researchers are presenting substantially the same work for publication on a number of different platforms, and that is becoming problematic. At its worst, what you will find is pretty much exactly the same article with a different title, different abstract, sometimes different introduction and conclusion, but the rest of it is exactly the same. It's the same article which is presented. And at best, you will find people will take the same set of results and they will write a number of different papers in which they write just slightly different conclusions or findings to them. In all ways, though, this can be a form of academic dishonesty. What is wrong with this is that you are presenting the same work for credit more than once. And in a context in which academics are measured in terms of the number of their research outputs, this is obviously fraudulent behavior. Someone is actually trying to get more credit than they are due for the work that they have done. And as long as subsidies continue to be paid for publications as they are in this country, getting more than one subsidy for the same piece of work is also clearly fraudulent behavior. What is more is that almost all journals I know of insist that when you submit an article that you attest to the fact that it has not been published elsewhere, nor is it under consideration for publication elsewhere. And so those who have published the same thing in two different places are also guilty of simple lying and deception. Of course, though, there are appropriate ways in which you can reuse your own work. So one can sometimes reuse a published article or parts thereof in a book or even in another article, sometimes with permission of the journal, but that needs to be cited correctly and you need to have got the right kinds of permissions. Another exceptional case is the exceptional case in which people are doing work towards a dissertation, a PhD or a master's degree. They're going to be submitting this for examination. In those cases, it has always been allowed that while you are doing your research or after you have completed your examination, you are allowed to publish parts of that as articles or even as a book, as long as it is transparent and as long as you cite it correctly. You do not have to quote yourself, you can use verbatim words, but you need to say something along the lines of, this article reflects some of the work in one of my chapters of my PhD, which was done at such and such a university under the supervision of such and such a person. Or the other way around, if you've published stuff before you've actually submitted your dissertation for examination, you're able to say at the beginning of your dissertation, chapter 3 of this dissertation has been published in such and such a journal and is used with their permission or something of that nature. So I want to end off with just one essential point more, and that is to make the point that in the end, the worst damage that can be done if you are found guilty of plagiarism is the damage that it does to yourself. In the end, it's your reputation and your moral character that are at stake, and people will ask questions about your moral fiber. It's interesting that when I was doing the research for this talk, when I was looking into serious cases of plagiarism, I found that in almost all the cases of serious plagiarism, there had not only been plagiarism, there had also been falsification of data or fabrication of data. And it was almost as though these things go hand in hand, that the plagiarist is more likely also to be someone who is likely to fabricate data. And so I think it's perfectly reasonable for people to wonder whether the scientist who finds themselves guilty of plagiarism is not also capable of other kinds of lapses of scientific ethics. So my recommendation is, for the sake of one's reputation, for the sake of scientific integrity, I'd suggest that it's always better to err on the safe side, to reference as much as possible, and even if you don't buy all of what is said about plagiarism being wrong, just do what needs to be done, follow the standard conventions of academic referencing, purely for the sake of your own reputation. Thank you very much.